Good evening. My name is Melanie McGacken from the Family Support Center of New Jersey. I hope everyone is well this evening and joining us from the comforts of your own home. I would like to welcome you to Redefining Autism, Legal and Clinical Implications of the New Diagnostic Criteria, being presented by Attorney Andrew Lindenberg and Dr. Elizabeth Roberts. I would like to take care of some webinar details to begin with. Once we start the webinar, you will have the opportunity to ask questions by clicking the dialog box on the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We will try to get to as many of the question topics as possible. At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Roberts, who will be co-presenting tonight's presentation. Dr. Roberts is a clinical assistant professor of child and adolescent psychiatry and a clinical neuropsychologist at both the Institute for Learning and Academic Achievement and the Autism Spectrum Disorders Clinical and Research Program. Over her 20-plus year career, Dr. Roberts has gained extensive experience evaluating and treating children and adults with developmental and acquired neurological and neuropsychiatric disorders. She also specialized in the diagnosis and treatment of children and adults with autism spectrum disorders and families affected by these conditions. Dr. Roberts provides comprehensive neuropsychological evaluations, diagnostic assessment, psychotherapy, parent training, and school consultations. She is research-level trained in the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised and the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. Dr. Roberts' specialties areas include the developmental disabilities, autism spectrum disorders, learning disabilities, ADHD, Tourette syndrome, traumatic brain injury, and other central nervous system conditions. At this time, I would like to welcome Dr. Roberts. Elizabeth, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great.
Thank you, Melanie.
I'm just going to hand over the control of the presentation to you.
Okay. Okay, and I should click show my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. And let me start. Great. Okay, so Andy and I are going to be talking about the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorders currently and the proposed diagnostic criteria in the DSM-V, which is scheduled to be published in May of 2013. So I'm going to start by just reviewing current concepts in autism spectrum disorders, and I'll be talking about that for a couple of minutes, and then Andy will be taking over and talking about what this means for special education and other rights that individuals with disabilities have. So just to introduce ourselves again, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Roberts, and I'm at the NYU Child Study Center with offices in New York and Hackensack. And Andy Lindenberg will introduce himself, and he's with Hinkle, Fingles, and Pryor, who have several offices across New Jersey. If I can, yes, okay. So I've told you what we're going to be talking about. And let's switch that. So I think most of you are probably familiar with the our current Bible of Psychiatric Diagnosis, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 4th edition. And this was published in 1994 by the American Psychiatric Association. It was preceded by the DSM-3, the DSM-R, and the original DSM. So it's been an interesting trajectory for psychiatric diagnosis, which has been fraught with controversy all along. Currently, autism spectrum disorders fall under the category of pervasive developmental disorders, or PDDs. I'm sure most of you are aware of that. And these disorders are developmental and manifest across the lifespan. The disorder is pervasive. By that I mean that it affects multiple areas of development. The core symptoms are difficult to treat. Key features of autism spectrum disorders are impairments in communication and social reciprocity, and the presence of narrow repetitive interests or behaviors. We refer to those sometimes as RRBI, repetitive behaviors or interests. So currently we recognize 3 major subtypes of autism spectrum disorders. That would be autism, Asperger's disorder, and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. There are 2 other less common subtypes of pervasive developmental disorder, childhood disintegrative disorder and rest disorder, that are listed in the DSM-IV, but we're really not going to be focusing on those today. They're very rare. So I want to make one important point, and I want to just say that this is my favorite slide whenever I present to any group, anytime. And the point I'm trying to make with this slide is that there is remarkable heterogeneity among and within our currently recognized ASD subtypes. And that occurs in the domain of language, the domain of intelligence, whatever we think of as intelligence, the domain of social ability, excuse me, and the behavioral repertoire of the person in question. Furthermore, there's incredible variability in motor disability and remarkable variability in the degree of associated psychopathology, specifically whether somebody has difficulty with mood regulation or depression, whether someone has difficulty with anxiety, obsessiveness, or difficulty with self-control and has, meltdowns and a high degree of reactivity. And the point I'm trying to make is that I've learned across the 2+ decades that I've tried to understand individuals with autism spectrum disorder that I can't make any assumptions about somebody's ability or disability in any particular domain based on what I know about their ability or disability in any other area of domain. And I've met all kinds of people with every different kind of pattern that you can imagine along in these different domains. So as I mentioned before, we've talked about autism or autistic disorder, PDD-NOS, Asperger disorder, and the other 2 subtypes that we won't be talking about. So how do we diagnose these conditions right now? The gold standard for diagnosis includes a very lengthy caretaker interview, the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised, and then a semi-structured session of play and conversation, which is the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule 2. The ADOS has recently been revised. It was just the revision came out this summer. And so now we're referring to it as the ADOS 2 because that represents the revision of the original ADOS. So these 2 diagnostic tools together provide offer a high degree of specificity in terms of determining whether somebody has an autism spectrum disorder or doesn't have an autism spectrum disorder. We also use a number of rating scales. I'm sure most of you are familiar with those. Those would be the CARS-2, the Childhood Autism Rating Scale, the Social Responsiveness Scale, or SRS, and then a number of questionnaires that were created by Dr. Simon Baron-Cohen in England, one of them being the Friendship Questionnaire. There's also, I think, the Emotional Questionnaire, or EQ, or Empathy Questionnaire, and then the Seeing with the Eyes test. And there's a number of tests that have been created by Dr. Simon Baron-Cohen. The Social Communication Questionnaire, the SCQ, is a distillation of the longer ADIR. So that's actually a kind of an offspring of the ADIR. Finally, there's the Krug Asperger's Disorder Index, the Gilliam Autism Ratings Scale 2, or GARS-2, and many, many others. So that's just to give you an idea that there's a lot of different ways that people identify people either at risk or as having autism spectrum disorder, definitely. So, excuse me, just briefly, this is just a quick screen to show you what the ADIR is. It's an interview. So I just downloaded a picture of the ADIR pamphlet from Google, just to show you that it's about a 2.5–3 hour interview of the caretakers, and it delves in great detail into the history of the individual's behavior in the domains of communication, social reciprocity. That would be, for example, sharing, offering comfort, making friends, being interested in other people, being interested in the approaches of other people, and a variety of social indices. And then the domain of behavior. So some examples of those items are repetitive play with objects, narrow interests, unusual interests, sensory behaviors, repetitive motor behaviors such as hand flapping or finger flicking and things like that. So it covers a lot of ground. It also covers ordinary features of development like toilet training and things like that. So that's the ADIR. What is the ADOS? The ADOS, as I said, is a semi-structured session of play and conversation. It's about 45 to 60 minutes in length. It should not go longer than that. And the ADOS is conceptualized and created in actually 5 modules now. Module 1 is for children with no language or some single words, and that might be, for example, a little child with no language at all. Module 2 is for children with individuals, it could be children or adults, with single words and a few phrases. So if a child or an adult has some phrases, then you would give Module 2. Module 3 is for fluent children and adolescents, and Module 4 is for fluent adolescents and adults. So each of the modules is organized around the same ideas, but they're slightly different depending on the individual's ability to use language to communicate. And finally, very important, we also have the ADOS Toddler, which I'm very excited about personally, and which is used for babies aged 12 months to 30 months. And the purpose of the Toddler ADOS is to identify individuals at younger and younger ages so that we can start treatment as soon as possible. Currently, the ADOS-2 has cutoff scores for the presence of autism and autism spectrum disorder, and it also has severity scores. Let's see if I can move this. There we go. Oh, this is a picture of the autism, the ADOS-2 kit. Sorry, let me move that again. Yep. This is a picture of the ADOS-2 kit just to give you an idea that it's full of really interesting stuff. And you can see that some of the stuff is more appropriate for little children, and the other materials would be okay to offer to 10-year-olds and 13-year-olds. And then the Module 4 really has very few actual activities. It's really more of an interview. There's a couple of materials that we use with Module 4, but it's mostly conversation. So, excuse me, what are we talking about? Proposals for the DSM-5 include that we expect it to be published in May of 2013, and that the subtypes that we currently recognize will be replaced altogether with a condition known as autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. And there will be no differentiation among autism, PDD-NOS, Asperger's syndrome, or these other ones, childhood disintegrative disorder, or Rett syndrome, and so on. So the ASD, the autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, will be made purely on behavioral symptoms that can accompany or not accompany any other medical diagnosis, such as Rett syndrome, or Fragile X, or tuberous sclerosis, or some of these other ones. And then there will be, along with that, essentially what I call a drop-down menu of associated difficulties, which could be anxiety disorder, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is very common, language delay, or cognitive impairment. So it's one diagnosis for everyone with a drop-down menu of areas of difficulty, other areas of difficulty. So beyond that, there will be further distinctions made according to severity levels. Severity levels are based on the amount of support needed due to challenges with social communication and restricted interests and repetitive behaviors. For example, a person could be diagnosed with ASD level 1, level 2, or level 3, depending on the level of support that's needed. Why are we doing this? Well, research has shown that the old way is not precise enough. What we've seen with research is that different clinicians will diagnose the same person with different disorders. And some clinicians will actually change their diagnosis of the same symptoms differently from year to year. So that's an interesting finding. So for example, what some researchers discovered is that clinicians located in different parts of the United States would administer the ADOS in the same way and would administer the ADIR in the same way, in a reliable, similar way, would score those diagnostic tools in the same way. The reliability in the scoring was very, very similar. And the agreement as to whether somebody was autistic or not was very high. However, what the individual clinician ended up actually calling that person varied quite a bit. So somebody with the same profile could be called PDD-NOS in one part of the country and Asperger's disorder in another part of the country. And furthermore, the research showed that the same clinician could actually call something different, call the same person something different from one year to the next. So it became evident to some people that autism is defined by a common set of behaviors and that it should be characterized by a single name according to severity. So what are the sources of these proposed changes? The sources of information that were used to make these changes were drawn from research and analysis of the research and expert opinion drawn from clinicians and researchers who have been in this field for their entire career. The revisions have been made with the hope that the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorders will be more specific, more reliable across time and across location and across clinician, and valid. So one of the reasons we're all here today is to talk about the intense concerns that the proposed changes have stirred up. The biggest concern is that individuals who are less affected or who are higher functioning will no longer meet the more strict diagnostic criteria and therefore will have difficulty accessing relevant services. So that's a big, big worry. A second worry that's related is that is the fate of individuals who are currently diagnosed with Asperger's disorder or PDD-NOS and who might actually lose their diagnosis when they are reevaluated. There is a great deal of uncertainty concerning how state and educational services and insurance companies will adopt these changes, and that's really what we're here to talk about today. So I think I'm going to hand this over to my colleague Andy Leinenberg, who's going to be talking about the legal ramifications of the proposed new diagnostic criteria for autism. And I think what I'm going to do now is change presenter.
Actually,
I'm going to shift over. Yeah,
Elizabeth,
Melanie, should I shift over to you?
I can do that for you even.
Okay.
Okay, so let's see. Andy? Andy, do you have control of the screen?
I believe that I do, Melanie.
Oh, great. Andy, if you don't mind, I'm just going to take a minute. I would like to introduce you, if you don't mind. And Elizabeth, I would love to thank you for your portion of the presentation. If you have the time, we would love you to stay on for the rest of the presentation to answer questions at the end, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. So at this time, we would like to continue with the presentation. I would like to introduce Attorney Andrew Linenberg. Andy is with the firm of Hinkle, Fingles, and Meyer. Andy has a demonstrated commitment for representing underserved and vulnerable populations. While in law school, he led pro bono projects and worked as a student attorney in a Rutgers Camden civil practice clinic. Andrew brings his civil practice passion to helping people with disabilities, particularly with special education matters. His commitment comes from having a father with multiple disabilities and growing up in Philadelphia public school system, where he recognized firsthand the inadequacies of some of the programs for children with disabilities. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you, Melanie, and I'd also like to thank Dr. Roberts for that great presentation on the clinical side of things and what we can expect in terms of changes to the DSM. And I'd also like to thank everyone for attending. I know it's a cold winter night, and you know, the holidays are coming up, and everyone's got lots of stuff on their plate. So really appreciate everyone's attention, and you know, we will pause it several times to try and you know, give you a chance to ask any questions that you may have particular to you, so that we can, you know, make this presentation as helpful and functional to your particular reasons for attending as possible. So, right, I'm going to talk about the legal ramifications. I mean, it's a pretty broad area, so I've tried to focus on the three main things that the clients that we see on a daily basis would be most concerned of with any potential changes to the diagnostic criteria for autism and any type of diagnosis on the spectrum. I just want to check to make sure that everyone can hear me. Melanie, can you confirm that for me?
I apologize. I'm obviously doing this from home. Yes, Andy, actually we have no comments so far, so I believe everyone can hear you. I'm going to mute myself now so everyone can hear.
Okay, I have two small dogs, and yeah, I absolutely love them. So hearing some dogs in the background is actually comforting to me somehow. So I tried to narrow it down to three general areas. One is obviously special education and related services. That would generally govern children who are in early intervention prior to the age of 3, and then what in New Jersey the domain from age 3 to age 21, which is the time frame for which a child with a disability who's classified as in need of special education or related services, they would be able to receive special education and related services from their school district at the school district's expense, not at the parent's expense. And they would be able to be educated until 21, unless, you know, they were higher functioning and they were able to complete the core curriculum for graduation prior to age 21. But if they do have some significant needs, they could be educated up until 21, and that's when you basically see the school bus stops coming at age 21, and the child is basically transitioned to adult life and post-academic life, and it could be transitional services, vocational services. Hopefully they'll find a position with a job coach in which they can find some fulfillment in a work-related role, or also DDD and residential services would pick up after the special education regime is over. The second area is eligibility for New Jersey's Division of Developmental Disabilities, commonly referred to as DDD. And the DDD eligibility is of particular concern because children with disabilities in some circumstances can receive DDD services prior to turning 18 and certainly prior to turning 21. However, after they turn 21, DDD is the primary entity in New Jersey that is responsible for providing services to people with developmental disabilities. So the whole idea is that parents are not footing the entire bill for all the special needs of people with disabilities themselves, and during 3 to 21 it would be by the school districts, and then after 21 it would be by DDD. And then the third area that I'd like to focus on today is laws affecting insurance coverage for children with autism. Some of you may have heard of them called parity laws. There's a federal law on this, and then each state has adopted some form of a parity law or other, and I will go over the federal law as well as New Jersey's law on insurance coverage, specifically as it relates to autism, and what the proposed changes to the DSM would mean in that regard. So first I'd like to just focus on special education for the time being, just to provide a basic framework so that everyone can be on the same page. I'm sure most of you have some experience with the special education legal framework in your own experiences with your own children. But since many of us are at different pages, I find that it's often helpful to start kind of with the basics. And a lot of times filling in those details may help you learn something that you did not know before. So pay particular attention if you still have school-age children, because much of this information is helpful in ensuring that your children are getting what they're supposed to be receiving in terms of special education and related services. So there are three, in terms of federal law, there are three general laws that govern special education. The first is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is commonly referred to as the IDEA. Most people don't refer to it as IDEA, even though it's spelled that way. So if you're trying to sound very savvy in an IEP meeting, don't say IDEA. Go with IDEA. So there's a lot of kind of alphabet soup, and I'll try and give you what the acronyms and the abbreviations are, so that you can kind of learn the lingo as we're going along. So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is it basically states that any child who's classified as in need of special education and related services is entitled to receive a free, appropriate education in the least restrictive environment. So the first acronym under the IDEA is FAPE, which is FAPE, Free, Appropriate Public Education. The second acronym that you should know is the Least Restrictive Environment, which is abbreviated LRE. So if you've ever seen these on IEPs, or if you heard the lingo in your own research, many of you are extremely well researched and could probably chime in on a lot of these issues. And lots of times when I do speaking engagements, I find that the parents and the groups that I present to are so extremely well researched and just have so much to add that at the last one I was at, I recommended that they actually form a parental support group from which parents can share their experiences, and then actually the organization decided to do it, and from what I understand, it's really thriving. Anyway, so free, appropriate public education. The free part is pretty clear. If you are providing services at your own expense for your child with a disability, then it's not free. It needs to be provided by the school district, as long as those services are required for your child to receive an appropriate education. Now, we'd like to thank Federal Congress and all the lawyers who have tangled with this law to give us a really vague standard, appropriate. It has been broken down over time to make it a little bit more meaningful, and over time case law has told us that appropriate is defined as the ability to make meaningful educational progress. Okay, so now at least we have the idea of progress, and although it's often disheartening to parents, I always tell them that although we all want what's best for our children, this is a minimum standard. It's that the districts have to provide enough education and the proper amount of education and services so that the child with a disability can make meaningful progress. They don't have to receive the best education, and it's not what placement or program would be best for them. It's just that program and services that would enable them to make progress. So if the child is stagnating in their education, or they are regressing, having behavioral regressions, or their grades are going down, arguably that's not progress, and that's kind of the easy way to tell that there's no progress. But there are some other ways you can tell. It's not just academic, for example. So like I said, if there are behaviors that are interfering with a child's learning, then those behaviors need to be appropriately addressed, such as when it's children with autism, the most recommended therapy would be ABA therapy, applied behavioral analysis, which has proven very successful. But it's not just limited to behavior. To receive an appropriate education, the child must also be appropriately learning social skills to the extent they have occupational therapy, physical therapy needs, or speech and language needs. All of those appropriate therapies should be provided. After a child turns 14, they should be receiving some level of vocational services and life skills building, so that they're getting ready for when they graduate, that they could enter the real world after their educational time is done and have some ability to function in the rest of society in a meaningful way. Now those are limited to, those are just the services and therapies that a child may need, but even if a child is receiving every service and receiving, academics such that they're receiving good grades, they still may not be receiving an appropriate education, because if a child cannot, the clinical term is generalize the information and skills that they're learning at school and be able to apply them outside of school, such as at home or in the community, then school is not really preparing them for the real world. So that generalizing concept is important to keep in mind. If they can't generalize those skills learned in school, then they may not be receiving an appropriate education. So now I'd like to move on from a discussion of the basics of the IDEA and talk about classification, because the definitions is where it's all at in this presentation tonight. So under the federal law, the IDEA, to be classified as in need of special education, the term that we're defining is child with a disability. And that means a child who is evaluated as having a speech or language impairment, a serious emotional disturbance, autism, a traumatic brain injury, other health impairment, a specific learning disability, multiple disabilities, blindness, deafness, and there are a few others. There are 13 categories under the federal definition of child with a disability. And not only do you have to be evaluated as having one of those categories, but because of that disability, the child requires special education and related services. So if the child has a disability but they're able to function at a level that's acceptable and make progress, then they would still not qualify as in need of special education. It has to be that because of that disability, they require special education and cannot be educated in the general mainstreamed educational environment. In addition, the child must be appropriately evaluated in accordance with the federal regulations that go with the IDEA and implement the IDEA. And so under those regulations, autism itself has a particular definition. And basically it amounts to a developmental disability that significantly affects verbal and nonverbal communication and social interaction, and it's generally evident before the age of 3, and the fact that you have all of those criteria met adversely affects the child's educational performance. And then they tell you in the implementing regulations for the IDEA that children who have autism are usually experience characteristics associated with autism, like repetitive activities, stereotypical movements, resistance to change in environment or daily routine, and unusual responses to sensory experiences or sensory sensitivity, requiring a multisensory approach. However, we also are told in the implementing regulations that a child will not be classified under the autism category if the educational performance is adversely affected by an emotional disturbance. So basically, like I started out by saying, there are 13 categories under the federal law, the IDEA, and one of them is emotional disturbance, another one is autism. So if you have a child who has a developmental disability that adversely affects their education, it's either going to be because of autism or because of emotional disturbance. But to receive the autism diagnosis or to receive the autism classification, it must be clear that it's not due to an emotional disturbance. And finally, usually the characteristics have to manifest prior to the age of 3, such that a child could be diagnosed as having autism prior to the age of 3. So that was this first one here, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And the there are two other main federal laws that we deal with in the special education regime that you should be aware of. The first is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and the second is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which everyone commonly refers to as the ADA. Basically, both of these have very broad definitions of disabilities, and essentially the proposed changes to the DSM will likely not affect the Section 504 and the Americans with Disabilities Act. What's important to know about those laws for parents who have children with any type of disability, but autism is included, is that they basically prohibit any public entity, such as a school district, that receives federal funding of any kind from discriminating against somebody on the basis of their disability. So if, for example, a school district is providing an appropriate education for everyone but your child, and your child has a disability, then arguably they are discriminating against your child on the basis of your child's disability. So when we sue school districts, and no one likes to think of lawsuits, it's an unpleasant business, but sometimes you're just left with no choice if your child's not getting what they need, and you need to somehow, let's say, motivate the school districts to take the appropriate steps to provide the services that your child needs. When we sue them, we will file a due process petition against the school district, and we will file under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA, saying that that's been violated. But we'll also say that there have been violations of Section 504 and the ADA as well, because they've essentially discriminated against a child on the basis of their disability by failing to provide them with an appropriate education. So those are the federal laws governing special education. Now I'd like to kind of focus a little bit more on New Jersey specific law. This is a little bit of a long slide, but I wanted to put the key language up there because I know a lot of you will be copying, pasting it, or copying it down somehow, or taking screenshots, or whatever the case is with your level of technological savvy. So New Jersey has special education laws that implement the IDEA, and they're done through the New Jersey Administrative Code. You'll see on the page the abbreviation NJAC. That's the abbreviation for the Administrative Code, and it's found in 6A:14 3-5. Again, it's all about definitions tonight, so if I sound a little bit technical, it's because I really want you to know what the language is that we're talking about, so that when I draw my conclusions at the end of the presentation, you'll know where they came from and won't think it's some kind of legal sleight of hand. So basically, in order to be classified as eligible to receive special education and related services in New Jersey, a child must have one or more of the 14 disabilities listed in that section of the Administrative Code, and that disability must adversely affect the student's educational performance, and the student must actually be in need of special education and related services in light of that disability. So it basically largely mirrors the framework that we talked about at the federal level when we discussed the IDEA. And we also know that the classification has to be based on assessments conducted, including by the school district's own personnel and the child study team, and assessments by other specialists. So a specialist could be, a speech and language therapist. It could be a neuropsychologist. It could be, a private expert that you've hired, someone who's, really knows this stuff, such as Dr. Elizabeth Roberts, for example. So what we see is that you need to get an evaluation, and classification depends on that evaluation for some of the disability categories under the Administrative Code in New Jersey. Now, let's just focus on autism in particular. Autism is defined in a very particularized way under the New Jersey Administrative Code. Basically, to receive a classification as in need of special education and related services on the basis of autism in New Jersey, a child would have to have a pervasive developmental delay. We talked about this a little bit earlier when Dr. Roberts was presenting, And basically, pervasive means that it significantly impacts multiple developmental areas. And so we see that that's actually spelled out for us in the New Jersey Administrative Code. So the pervasive developmental delay must significantly impact both of these areas, verbal and nonverbal communication, as well as social interaction. So if we take a step back from the technical side of things and just take a look, it basically has to be a developmental disability that is having some type of significant interference with a child's ability to communicate and with their social skills. And it also must adversely affect the student's educational performance. So again, it does largely mimic the federal framework under the IDEA. It's just spelled out in a little bit more detail on this New Jersey Administrative Code. Again, the onset must be evident prior to age 3. And to receive an autism classification for special education, the evaluators on the child study team and the independent consultants that you would hire would also be looking for other characteristics that are generally associated with autism, such as repetitive activities, stereotypical movements. Those stereotypical movements might be arm flapping, finger flicking, some other types of stereotypical movements. Perseverative speech may be another stereotypical activity that they engage in. Resistance to environmental change or changes in daily routine. Also, under that category, I would also add transitional issues with transition. From different locations, children with autism would generally respond, would have issues and difficulty adapting to new locations, whether it's in school, changes in the bus staff, changes in the other children in the room perhaps. And then going through this list again, unusual responses to sensory experiences and lack of responsiveness to others. Now, this list is a non-exhaustive list. It's provided in the Administrative Code. A child to receive to receive classification under the category of autism for purposes of special education, a child wouldn't need to have all of them, or wouldn't need to have particular ones, but they would have to have some of these autism-related characteristics. And again, they note that it cannot be due to emotional disturbance. Now, the proposed changes to the DSM, I want to kind of compare in encapsulated form so you see what we're talking about, the current definition versus the proposed definition. So the current definition, basically a child would qualify under the current definition, would qualify for an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis if the individual exhibits 6 out of 12 behaviors, including social interaction, communication, or repetitive behaviors. So it's kind of a broad definition. Now, under the change in the definition, the person would have to exhibit 3 deficits under one single heading, that is communication and social interaction. So in your mind, picture that there's a hyphen between communication and social interaction. It's all one category now. But what they haven't changed the diagnostic criteria in one sense, because those 2 categories, social interaction and communication, were existing under the current definition. So they're there. You can see them up here. They're there as separate categories. But to increase accuracy and to increase the uniformity in diagnosing, the proposed changes to the DSM have lumped them together because many diagnosticians in the field have determined that most people who exhibit some form of a disability that falls within the spectrum, somewhere on the spectrum, they usually have a deficit in both communication and social interaction, and so they decided to make that one category. It's not true in all instances, and we'll probably get into that, but they're trying to streamline this a little bit and create increased uniformity. The second thing is, in addition to exhibiting 3 deficits in that communication social interaction category, to receive an autism diagnosis under the proposed DSM criteria, the child would also have to have at least 2 repetitive behaviors. The repetitive behaviors are, again, perhaps perseverative speech, arm flapping, stereotypical movements, picking things up and putting them down in the same order in a repetitive fashion. So the change is not that great when you look at what the categories are. It's not like they're now inserting new criteria that were not there before. They're kind of changing the way that the diagnostic criteria are culled together. Now, I know that many of you want to know, what's the end result. So when you look at those diagnostic criteria and you compare them to New Jersey's definition of autism for purposes of receiving classification for special education in New Jersey, the good news is that the definition that New Jersey uses is not going to be changed. It will probably not be affected at all by the actual change to the diagnostic criteria. The only thing that we're a little bit concerned of, and I'll get into this a little bit later, to the extent that a child has to have an evaluation or assessment and receive an autism diagnosis, if they're a higher functioning individual, they have Asperger's, high functioning autism, PDD-NOS, and they are, for some reason, no longer going to be diagnosed on the autism spectrum, that may give them a little bit of an issue in terms of getting eligibility for special education. However, the New Jersey definition of autism is quite broad, and that is remaining unchanged. So the diagnostic criteria changing should not largely impact eligibility for special education. But I'm sure there will be questions on that, and I'm happy to try and field them. And I do have another slide just on that point later on. So I will just kind of reserve on that, and we can get into it later. Also, the good news is that because they changed, or they proposed to change the diagnostic criteria from social and communication under one category and requiring at least 2 repetitive behavior deficits. The American Psychiatric Association has also proposed that a new category be added to the DSM. So that new category would be the social communication disorder. It's a separate disorder. It's not autism. However, it would help in terms of ensuring that children who are higher functioning or children who would currently qualify on the autism spectrum under the existing criteria and who we are concerned may potentially be left off under the new criteria, this would help to ensure that they would actually still be eligible to receive special education according to New Jersey law. So the way that would work, a child who basically, to receive a diagnosis of social communication disorder, a child would have to have the same social and communication deficits as for autism, but they would not be able to exhibit the presence of the repetitive behavior requirements. And that diagnosis could very well meet the eligibility criteria for New Jersey's communication impairment classification category. So remember, under New Jersey law, there's 14 classification categories, one of which is autism. A different one is communication impaired. And just to give you, I didn't want to bog you down with too much language on these slides, but I can let you know what the definition is for communication impaired. It basically means that it's a language disorder that affects areas of morphology, syntax, semantics, and/or pragmatic discourse, which adversely affects a student's educational performance, and it's not due to an auditory impairment. And the definition gets a little bit more technical. Basically, through functional assessment and testing, a child would have to receive 1.5 standard deviations below a typically developing peer in terms of language, and not just what we think of in terms of traditional speech, such as articulation and being able to pronounce words, but also pragmatic language, such as can a child go over to somebody in their play group and ask to play, ask to join the group, and can they ask for help when they need it? It could also mean that they're not able to make eye contact and those other kind of receptive, expressive skills that we think of with pragmatic language. And so if a child met the criteria for social communication disorder, it's very likely that they would indeed meet the communication impaired criteria under New Jersey law. So with that said, we don't anticipate that this change in the proposed criteria will have a significant impact in people who ordinarily would qualify under the current criteria for special education. We don't think that it will significantly impact eligibility. So at this point, I do want to pause because I've gotten through basically the first of those main categories I wanted to focus on, the second being DDD eligibility, and the third is insurance coverage. Just wanted to pause to see if there were any questions so that I don't delve too far into my next topic if someone had anything that they wanted to have me clarify.
Thanks, Andy. The one question that did come through so far, it actually just came in. It says, so eligibility would be granted under a different criteria if your child was to lose services, possibly?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Thank you for whoever submitted, and also thank you, Melanie. There's a bunch of things wrapped up in there. Leave it to us lawyers to kind of pick everything apart and say that the answer really depends on what you're asking. The first thing is, if a child already is classified as in need of special education and related services under the autism category, that diagnosis is thought to stand. We hope and are understanding, those of us in the field, including the ARC and Autism Speaks and the other autism advocacy and awareness groups, we all believe that the existing diagnosis would stand and that a child would not be suddenly kicked out of eligibility, so to speak. The only time that that would really become an issue is when it comes time for you asking for a service that had never been provided before. And so at that point, a school district may want to request that the child be reevaluated, and the reevaluation may come under the new diagnostic criteria. However, we don't believe that the child will be kicked off of their existing services, and I think that the districts are very savvy in terms of knowing that a child who had for years been receiving services of some kind based on an autism diagnosis, just because the definition changed doesn't mean that that student who had significant needs and was receiving services should no longer be receiving them. So in that case, I think that the districts would largely be nervous to do anything to kick the children off of services, and it's because they know that there are watchdog groups and also law firms that would bring suit against them if the parents brought that to the law firm's attention. So that's the first thing. I don't think that kids who are currently getting services would lose them based on a change in the definition for the diagnostic criteria. The second part of the question, though, is will eligibility be affected in general? So the definition for autism under New Jersey's special education laws is not going to change. The only thing that would potentially have a negative impact is if a child who's higher functioning or who would have Asperger's or PDD-NOS under the existing diagnostic criteria, if that person, for whatever reason, would not meet the diagnostic criteria under the new proposed diagnostic criteria, and they have not yet been diagnosed, so they would meet it if under the current diagnostic criteria, but once the change occurs, and if they had not been previously diagnosed, if they're diagnosed for the first time under the new criteria, if they were for some reason not able to receive a diagnosis of autism, that may impact whether we would have sufficient evaluations and diagnostic evidence to support the claim for eligibility for special education and related services in New Jersey to the extent the child had never received them before. However, if the problem is that they're not getting diagnosed because they don't have the repetitive behaviors, and those repetitive behaviors are required for an autism diagnosis, it's very possible that they would be classified under this new diagnostic disorder, which is the social communication disorder. And if that's the case, more than likely the child would then be able to be eligible for special education under the communication impaired category under New Jersey's law classification system for special education. Now, the third thing that was packed into that question, whoever asked that question, I bet I'm providing more information than you bargained for, but the third thing that the question raised for me was, you know, just taking a step back from all the technical definitions that we've been talking about, parents often ask, you know, well, what if my child is really autistic and they're identified as eligible for special education under a different category? For example, you heard when Dr. Roberts was speaking earlier that the same clinicians could be, even from year to year, could change their diagnosis. So a child with high-functioning autism, for example, may be first diagnosed with ADHD, and may, a year later, by the very same clinician, could be diagnosed with high-functioning autism. Now, ADHD would not qualify them for classification under the category of autism, according to New Jersey's special education regulations. However, ADHD is covered under the category of other health impaired, which is one of the other 14 categories under New Jersey's regulatory scheme, just like communication impaired is another of those 14 categories. So the long and short of it is, you know, often when I have clients who I meet with for the first time, they may say, look, my child was initially classified under the preschool disabled category or the other health impaired category. And now, you know, we've continued to do private testing and we realize that the child has actually been diagnosed with high functioning autism or some other autism spectrum disorder. And the child's now exhibiting, you know, some additional needs such as behaviors or receptive expressive language issues, maybe anxiety disorder. And so once the child's classified as in need of special education, however, under any of the 14 categories, the school district is not allowed to limit the services provided to the child as long as the child has needs that are based on their disability, whatever those disabilities are. And just as the child grows and their needs develop differently, those needs have to be met. And so the basic framework of special education law is that the district is supposed to individually evaluate what the child's disabilities are and the needs in light of those disabilities and tailor a program that's customized to those disabilities and those needs that's going to help this child make meaningful educational progress. Now, in practice, what we usually see is the districts are not, you know, due to budget restraints and other concerns, the districts don't tailor new programs for every student. They try to shoehorn each student into their existing programs and provide additional support services and therapies, you know, to the extent possible in order to make up for that shoehorn approach. And that largely does work, you know, not always in district. Sometimes it has to be done at a specialized alternative appropriate placement out of district. But what I was trying to say is basically you can think of it as once you're through the gate for those for classification as in need of special education, it doesn't matter which turnstile you went through, whether it was autism, communication impaired, other health impaired. Once you're through, the district is obligated to meet all of the child's needs in light of their disabilities. And so they can't say, no, you were only other health impaired, ADHD, you can't get ABA therapy because that's only for kids with autism. No, that's not how it works. Once they're classified, to the extent the child exhibits behaviors or other needs in light of their disabilities, the district must meet them in order to have the child receive an appropriate education. I think that answered the question. Melanie, were there any others? Or if not, I'm happy to move on to my next subtopic.
Andrew, please move on. That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much, everybody, for your continued attention. So the next topic is DDD eligibility. First topic we talked about was special education. Now we want to look at, is the proposed change to the diagnostic criteria, is it going to affect DDD eligibility? The definition that we're dealing with in DDD, in the DDD arena, is the definition of developmental disability. It's got to be a severe chronic disability which is attributable to mental and physical impairment, or a combination of that, which manifests before the age of 22. It's likely to continue indefinitely, and it results in functional limits that are substantial and occur in 3 or more of the major life activities listed in the DDD regulations. Those major life activities include self-care, receptive and expressive language, learning, mobility, self-direction, capacity for independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. So basically looking at, can a person take care of themselves? Can they ask for help when they need it? Are they able to communicate? Can they manage their own affairs? Do they recognize dangers? Are they able to get around on their own? And so those are the types of things that you look at. Also, there's a need for some sort of extended or lifelong services, and the developmental disability definition expressly includes many things, but one of which is autism. So it includes intellectual disability, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, spina bifida, a whole slew of other ones, but it specifically expressly includes autism. So if you meet the definition for autism, then you would likely meet the definition of developmental disability under DDD's regulations. So some people have asked, as I was preparing for this presentation, some people had asked whether the definition for eligibility for DDD will change, because, as some of you may know, DDD is transitioning some of the people it now serves from the DDD regime to the Department of Children and Families, DCF. Told you there was a lot of acronyms. And so basically, the way we understand it, the people who would be applying for DCF would probably have to meet the same criteria that they need to meet for DDD eligibility, and so we don't think that'll change. However, at the current time, DCF has not yet updated its regulations. I would go into the DCF regulations more in depth, but it's a little bit off the topic. That could be its own presentation. And in fact, my esteemed colleague Maria Fisher will be presenting on the change in children's services from DDD to DCF on December 12th through another one of these webinars in conjunction with family support. And so, if you're interested, you should definitely attend that lecture. And it is very interesting, and there are a lot of changes going on between DCF and DDD, but I'd like to reserve on that because, like I said, it really is just an entire presentation in and of itself. So the good news in terms of DDD eligibility, the DSM changes are not going to affect the definition of developmental disability for purposes of DDD eligibility. Particularly, to receive DDD eligibility, you just need to have a diagnosis of autism. But more than that, you have to basically, the DDD definition is very broad. It includes much more than autism, other types of disabilities, and it just requires that the disability manifest before age 22, be attributable to a significant mental or physical impairment or combination thereof, and affect 3 or more of those major life activities. So even under the new diagnostic criteria, a person who wouldn't receive an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis for whatever reason could still absolutely meet all of the criteria for DDD eligibility. So we're not too worried about eligibility for DDD changing or being negatively impacted by the proposed changes to the DSM. I'm going to keep going and try and finish up, and then I'll reserve some time for questions at the end. The third topic that I wanted to go into is insurance coverage for autism services. Many of you have perhaps heard that there's a mental health parity law, or you may have heard of parity laws in general as they intersect with insurance coverage and autism. A lot of clients come in and they have children or a child on the autism spectrum and want to know if an insurance company is required to provide their child with ABA services. Many insurance companies will often say, no, we're not going to provide ABA therapy. Some insurance companies will, some won't. Actually, they all should be, at least in New Jersey. I'll get into that in a little bit. So first, let's start with the Mental Health Parity Law, which is a federal law. It's the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act of 2008. It requires that if a state has mental health treatment, it must be provided at a parity level, which means that to the extent that a state provides coverage for developmental disabilities or mental disabilities, and if the state defines autism under either developmental disability or mental disability, then the insurance providers and healthcare providers cannot refuse to provide services for a person with autism, including ABA therapy, just because the insurance coverage or the insurance provider or the healthcare provider would want to discriminate against an individual on the basis of an autism diagnosis or other disability. So if they're providing services for people with mental disabilities or developmental disabilities, to the extent they're providing any, they have to provide equal coverage to everyone, and they can't say, no, you're not going to get ABA therapy because you have autism and not a different diagnosis. Now that applies to providers and insurance coverage at the federal level. Not all people have federal health insurance plans, though. For example, Medicaid, which is a means-tested government program for medical coverage for people with disabilities, for example, that is a federal coverage law. So that would be governed by this Mental Health Parity Act, and anyone accepting Medicaid would have to, provider-wise, would have to provide at parity level. Now let's go into New Jersey's parity law. It requires that insurance carriers provide coverage for expenses incurred in screening and diagnosing autism or other developmental disabilities. It would also require coverage for expenses incurred for medically necessary physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech and language for treatment of autism, medically necessary behavioral interventions based on ABA principles and related structured behavioral programs for treatment of autism in individuals under the age of, under the age of 21. And it would also have to provide a benefit for coverage of the family cost share expenses incurred for certain health care services obtained through early intervention system in New Jersey. So New Jersey's health parity law covers a lot, and it expressly covers ABA therapy for individuals with autism who are under the age of 21. Now, how is autism defined under New Jersey's parity law? It's basically defined to mean autism and related conditions, often included under the phrase autism spectrum disorder. So, clinically speaking, that includes several conditions which would be classified under PDD. You've got PDD, NOS, Asperger's, high-functioning autism, as well as autism itself. And this definition is broader than that contained in the DSM. So also noteworthy about the New Jersey's health parity law is that it applies to all health insurance policies issued or renewed on or after February 9th, I think it is, 2010, that provide hospital and medical expense benefits, including HMOs and health service corporation contracts. Because the federal parity law preempts state law, the state law has group health plans that are that can impose a $36,000 limit per calendar year for ABA-related services that are provided for they're provided in the state of New Jersey. But since the federal law would preempt that, an exemption of the federal law would be required in order for an insurance company to impose that $36,000 limit per calendar year on ABA services. So there's kind of a dual protection in there. So basically the good news is that in terms of insurance coverage, the proposed changes to the DSM is not going to likely affect the applicability or coverage of federal or state parity non-discrimination laws. So we do have a few overarching concerns, and experts in the field all agree that we just don't know, what's going to happen once the diagnostic criteria in the DSM for autism change. There, many of you have read articles in the New York Times and related noteworthy publications that there's a battle between experts in the field as to, some people thought that as many as 45% of individuals who currently would qualify under the existing criteria with PDD-NOS, Asperger's, or high-functioning autism would no longer qualify under the changed diagnostic criteria. And most recently, another study came out, and in the beginning of October of this year, that said no, those other numbers were skewed, and it's not going to affect more than 10% of people. And to the extent it does affect them, they would likely, qualify under the new proposed category of the communication disorder. So, the long and short of that is there are lots of different methodologies employed in those studies, and that's why you see different changes in the numbers. But unfortunately, no one's sure exactly how many people will be affected. Most experts I've talked to have thought that the change will not likely exclude many people from potential diagnoses, and that everybody would still be able to receive their diagnosis that they ordinarily would have, but that the way that it's going to be diagnosed will be more uniform. And the other thing that will help us, especially from an advocacy perspective, for lawyers looking for ways to require districts to provide additional services, is the severity level. So if someone has an autism spectrum disorder, which is the diagnosis under the new criteria, it's just ASD, the severity levels will help us be able to request services. So we're not thinking of it in terms of high functioning or low functioning. We're thinking in terms of how severe is this child's needs, such that they do need increased behavioral therapy or whatever the case may be. And labels aside, once the child is classified, to the extent that they have needs that are not being met, then the school districts are obligated to meet those needs. So I've gone over the concerns. Some things to keep in mind again are that the proposed additional category in the DSM of social communication disorder would likely help offset anyone who might be excluded from an ASD diagnosis, and also those severity levels, which are, I think, going to be helpful in terms of asking for more services. The reason why is because oftentimes school districts, it's been kind of a hot topic, a modern trend in school district treatment of individuals with disabilities. If they have an Asperger's, high-functioning autism, or PDD-NOS diagnosis, then they may not get as many services as someone else with a different type of autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. And the reason is because the district officials have their own stereotypes that they harbor, and the stereotypes that come with some of those diagnoses may manifest in a way that is inaccurate. For example, a student with high functioning autism may have, really good grades. They may even be in advanced academic classes, but may have significant social deficits in terms of expressive and receptive language, pragmatic social language skills, and self-help and vocational skills. And so they may still have to be educated until they're 21 in order to work on developing those skills. And so the district would say, no, they can graduate when they're 18 because they're doing well academically. And, we often find ourselves making the case that, no, it's not just academics alone. It's, are they making appropriate, meaningful academic progress, and are they able to build the other skills that they need such that they're ready to graduate and go on to the, the post-scholastic realm. And so to the extent these severity levels will be additional labels, I think that they'll be helpful in helping to dispel some of those traditional stereotypes that may have come with people who are just unfamiliar with an individualized child's needs in light of particular autism spectrum disorder. So with that, I'd like to close and open it up for some questions. Also, I want to remind everybody that there are upcoming additional webinars on topics of interest. They will be conducted by people from my firm. Paul Pryor will be speaking on the innovative housing solutions beyond group homes, and Maria Fisher of my office will be presenting on the transition between DDD and DCF, and those will both be happening through family support within the next 2 weeks. And yeah, they're both excellent speakers, so I encourage you all to participate. So with that, Melanie, I'd like to open it up for questions, and I invite, if anyone has a particular question for Dr. Roberts, I'd invite them to ask her as well.
Great, thank you, Andrew. We actually have a lot of wonderful comments coming in about tonight's presentation. I am going to pick out a couple of questions just to give yourself along with Dr. Roberts. And then the other questions that we don't get to this evening, I will definitely forward to both of you if you want to address those personally. So Andrew, the first question will be, my child is not due for reevaluation for another 2 years. If the school offers to reevaluate early, what are my rights to deny this reevaluation in fear that he might not meet the new criteria for diagnosis?
Okay, great question. Yes, that's under the New Jersey law. Children are eligible, and the school district is required to perform triennial. So evaluations must be performed every 3 years, and there's a battery of common tests that they would do as part of those triennial evaluations, which include social, speech and language, possibly behavioral, and as well as educational. So that would cover their academics and their learning style, and they'll also take perform tests to basically get their IQ of the child. Now, you can request, if you feel that that your child has needs that have changed, you can actually request that a particular evaluation be performed earlier than the 3 years. So if the district, you may be asking for, I want increased language, speech and language therapy, or I think my child needs group speech and he's only getting individual, or something like that. And the district, if they balk, then you can request in writing that they conduct a new evaluation. Now, the law changed about 6 months ago. You used to have to request all of your evaluations at one time, and if you'd have to wait for the district to either perform them or refuse to perform the evaluation that you're requesting. And if you received a negative evaluation that you disagreed with, at that point you could request in writing that the district provide an independent educational evaluation, an IEE. And so basically the district would come up with a list of 3 experts that they've worked with in the past, present you with the list. You would pick someone from that list who would provide yet a second opinion basically on that same category of evaluation. Now you no longer need to do that. You don't have to wait for an objectionable one. You can just say, I'd like this evaluation, and if the district refuses, you can say, fine, I want an independent evaluation. And that process is paid for by the district. So strategically, if you were worried that your child may no longer meet the diagnosis and you have something you think is changed enough about your child's needs that it might be time to ask for the evaluation early, you could potentially trigger the evaluation earlier before the changes to the DSM go into place, such that they would then have to wait an additional 3 years from that time. So you'd get some extra time if you were nervous that the diagnostic criteria would change your child's eligibility. But in the end, eventually the district's going to have to perform the triennial evaluations. And so even if you limited it to one category you thought that should be performed early, they'd still have to do the other ones once the 3 years has come around. So if the district is requesting that permission that you have the triennial evaluations performed early, but it's after the time the diagnostic criteria have gone, I would, there's not much you can do to prevent them from doing that. You can refuse consent for the evaluation, but eventually, if it's after the new changes to the DSM have gone into effect, like after May 2013, then you probably can't hold them at bay forever. So I would almost recommend just getting it over with and seeing where the chips fall, because if you end up needing to fight that determination in order to maintain your child's eligibility, you'd want to do it as early as possible so that the child doesn't receive any gap in services. But still, I have to warn that no one's sure exactly what will happen with the re-eligibility. But from our perspective, we don't believe that districts would be taking children who previously qualified as in need of special education, taking them off and kicking them out of the special education regime suddenly, because honestly it would be more of a problem for them to have a child who requires special education to be in a fully mainstream environment with no supports. That would create additional challenges for the district in its mainstream classrooms, but it would also likely open them up to liability. Just because the definition changed doesn't mean that the child changed. So I think that they know that on the practical level, and they would be worried about potential litigation.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Dr. Roberts, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Great. So the next question I have is for you. How is a STAT, S-T-A-T, different from that of other diagnostic tools? I am trying to understand if a STAT can actually determine if a child is autistic and if a diagnosis can be made using this. I know many specialists who use this as a screening tool for toddlers.
Wow, okay. I don't use the STAT. I don't know that much about the STAT. I've never seen the STAT described in a report. Why doesn't the questioner tell me what STAT even stands for? Because I am not even sure I'm aware of that tool.
Okay, so I will wait for the person who asked that question to reply to your request. I do have another question actually that's very similar to that.
Great.
The model, I apologize, I'm trying to read this on a very small screen. The model to a diagnosis of a toddler that you discussed previously, how accurate is a diagnosis for a child who is under 18 months? Typically, the age of diagnosis of autism, I thought, was closer to the age of 2 or 3.
Yes. So we're very excited about the toddler ADOS, and what we use this tool for is to identify kids who appear to be strongly at risk for an eventual diagnosis of autism. So I think when we write the report on a very, very young child, we describe the response to the ADOS, the toddler ADOS, and we describe it qualitatively as showing a high risk for an eventual diagnosis of autism or a lower risk. But it has excellent research-based specificity concerning autism in very young children. So it's an excellent tool, and there's a burgeoning field of service around early intervention. For example, the Denver Early Start model is gaining a lot of popularity right now and credibility as an evidence-based treatment model for treating very, very young children with signs of autistic disorder. So the point I'm trying to make is that you can use the toddler ADOS to identify a child who's highly at risk as young as 12 months and go ahead and start therapies very, very early and hopefully improve the outcome or turn the boat around. So that's why we're excited about the toddler ADOS.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. And to respond to your request, it's called the Screening Tool for Autism in Toddlers. Right, so that's all I know. That's all I know. I know my son's neurodevelopmental pediatrician used it for his evaluation. Do you have a response?
Okay. So I used my handy-dandy iPhone to find a nice picture of it while you were asking me about that. And I think the point is, as a psychologist in the field of autism spectrum disorders, I rely on a very lengthy evaluation that includes the ADIR and the toddler ADOS. And this sounds like it's a handy tool in a developmental pediatrician's office. There's also the MChat, for example. So these are screening tools to identify autism in very young children. And I think they're excellent in the hands of pediatricians who only have a couple of minutes or have a short visit in the pediatrician's office to identify and to identify with the mother and through observation children who need further evaluation. So I now have forgotten the original question, but I think the point is there's a difference between a screening tool and a diagnostic tool. That's really the main point I want to make. This is a screening tool. It flags kids who might have an autism spectrum disorder, but it's going to have a lot of false positives. That's by its very nature. And then you identify those kids who appear to be at risk, and then you refer them for more a lengthier and more precise evaluation. And some of those kids are in fact going to go on to be diagnosed, and some of them are not going to be diagnosed. So can you represent the question about the stat? That whether someone's going to use it to definitively diagnose? Is that the question? It says it takes about 20 minutes to administer.
I think you actually did answer the question.
Okay, good.
But I will definitely forward that question to you with the contact of the family member that asked.
Excellent.
So thank you very much, Dr. Roberts, and also Andrew. We definitely appreciate all your time and help this evening. We would love to welcome everyone to join us for the next webinar series. It's actually a very popular one. It's Creative Options for Housing, Funding, and Support Services, and that will take place on December 5th, again with the firm of Hinkle, Fingles, and Pryor. On behalf of myself, Attorney Andrew Lindenberg, and Dr. Elizabeth Roberts, we would like to thank you for joining us for this evening's presentation. Your feedback is important to us, so please look for your evaluation via email within the next 24 hours. Your input given during these evaluations help determine future topics, so we definitely encourage you to complete this. The webinar will be archived on the Family Support Center of New Jersey website. That is fscnj.org. That should be archived within the next week. You'll be able to see the PowerPoint presentation and hear the audio also. So thank you everyone for joining us, and please have a wonderful evening. Thank you
very much,
Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks a lot, everybody.